Thank you, John. So it's a real pleasure to be with you all here today and to invite my friend Todd to be here with us. I spent 17 years in ministry out in California before coming back here to Terre Haute about 4 years ago. And Todd and I started bumping into each other a lot. We were both Fuller Seminary grads and had a lot of pastor friends in common. And for about 5 or 6 years, there was a group formed called Presbyterian Global Fellowship, which had been headed up at that time by Jerry Deck, who's now at Zionsville Presbyterian Church. But we kind of met through some of those connections, and it was a group looking at what does it mean to be missional, how do we deal with adaptive change, and how do we try to lead in a rapidly changing, discontinuous kind of world. And so about 5 years ago or so, Todd's book, Canoeing the Mountains, came out, and I was leading a district of churches in San Diego County, and we invited him to come down and present to our leaders there. And it was just a very great day, very inspiring, and really created a lot of conversations as we're trying to figure out what it means to live in this world and lead in this world that we're in now. And so then this past year, started reading the book again with a local covenant group here in town with Dennis Tyson and Rick Swan and Tom Barnett and Rebecca Smith and Julie Putman, and just started having lots of great conversations and saying, you know, this is a book that really is describing what we're up against right now. And these are the conversations we need to be having with a lot more people, and we wanted to invite people to kind of go on this journey with us. And so when we contacted Todd to see if he was available to come and speak, like right at the same time, he also got an invitation to speak yesterday up in the Chicago area. And so I don't know if that was providentially or predestined, but he's here today, so, well, you know, depends on which group you're talking to. We're just great that all this has worked out. So Todd is Todd spent 10 years in ministry at Hollywood Presbyterian Church, worked with senior pastor Lloyd Ogilvie, who later left Hollywood to go to Washington, D.C. to be chaplain of the United States Senate. When he left there, he went down to San Clemente Presbyterian Church, was senior pastor for 17 years there, and for the last 5 years has been vice president at Fuller Seminary, working with leadership and formation. And here in these last 5 years at Fuller, he's actually working every day on adaptive change. So what he writes about in the book is not just academic theory that sounds nice. He's actually in the middle of this stuff every day. And in the seminary world, the higher education world that's going on today, what they're finding is that some people want to go to seminary, but they don't actually want to move and actually go to the physical campus. They want to go to seminary in their homes on their computer screens. And so Fuller's been making this huge shift, and over the last couple of years have launched Fuller Studio with the Conversing podcast. This year they came out with Fuller Platform, and now Fuller Equip. And so tons and tons of resources are now online, videos, courses. You can get certificates. A lot of people today don't want a certificate. They don't even want a degree. They just want to take classes. They just want to learn. And so there's been this huge push to get into the digital world, and it's been a huge adaptive change, and it's not always been easy. A lot of rough spots, but so he's been right in the middle of all of this. Todd is a husband. He's a father of 2 grown children. He's a pastor, teacher, educator, author. Spent some time this summer working on his next book, which hopefully will come out next year. Does a lot of different things. But most importantly, Todd is a child of God. He's a follower of Jesus Christ. He's a caring human being. And when he comes today, I think he's just as interested in learning from you as we are from learning from him. So let's give a big, warm, Midwestern welcome to Todd Bolsinger.
Good morning. Am I on? Okay, good. Just making sure. It is very, very nice to be here with you all. Thank you for welcoming me. It's also fun to hear Clark talk Methodist. He said he's part of a district that's called a presbytery in our world. So you've already converted him well. Way to go. Nice job. Things are. See, it shows you the demonstration of transformation by relationships, and we'll talk a lot about that today. So for the better part of over 10 years, I've gone around the country basically quoting my very favorite description of leadership. Here's the definition. Leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. This comes from Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky at Harvard, and this is actually really helpful because what it helps us get a sense for is why leadership is just so difficult and why it's so tricky. And what's also helpful is why sometimes talking about leadership from a biblical perspective is kind of so elusive. One of my colleagues at Fuller, probably our most renowned Old Testament professor, John Goldingay, one time when I was talking about leadership said, look, if you search the Bible, basically you don't get it's not easy to find a theology of leadership. He said the only theology of leadership you can really be confident is this. If God is leading, things usually are going well, and when humans are leading, they're usually not, right? So it's hard to talk about leadership in the way that we sometimes think about it. So but what's helpful to me is to think about leadership compared to another biblical category there was a lot of information, lots of verses, lots of themes throughout the scriptures. So where you find very little actually on leadership, you find a lot on management. It's not called management, it's called stewardship. When you think about it this way, then you start to recognize that what management is, what stewardship is, it is taking care of the things entrusted to our care. That's one of the lines from one of my colleagues, Scott Cormode. It's taking care of that which is entrusted to your care and then delivering it over to the next people who will care for it. It's taking people where they need to go and where they want to go, and when you get them there, they thank you for it. So for 17 years when I was at San Clemente Presbyterian and I was looking for a youth leader, I look back and realized what I really wanted was a youth manager. You take 10 kids to camp, you got to bring 10 kids home. 90% is not an A, man. It's like it's a bad day, right? I used to take a group of high school kids every year to the top of Half Dome in Yosemite National Park. You ever seen Half Dome, that iconic mountain? You can actually hike 9 miles to the base of Half Dome, and then there's these 300 yards that you go up the side holding on to cables that are actually put into the granite peak. And I would take a group of high school kids, all of them beach kids, right? So their idea of walking uphill is to the parking lot from the beach. And I would take them on this hike where they would go 9 miles and start early in the morning. They'd have to pull themselves up these cables and they'd get up to the top and it would be this amazing experience. And what I discovered is really quickly is that in August, if you take a group of high school kids, there are certain kids who are in really, really good shape. They're the swimming team, the cross-country team, the wrestling team, and the rest of us mere mortals are just trying to get up there praying the whole way. And when we would get to the base of the cables, the very first year I was there was a group of kids who were there just early. They're just waiting to go up, and another group of kids were, of course, trailing behind, and I'm the pastor, so I got to make sure everybody gets up safely. So one of the kids, Eric, comes to me and says, look, Pastor Todd, how about if a few of us just go up, we'll find a place to have our picnic, we'll wait till you get there, when everybody gets up here, we'll take the group shot, and we'll have the picnic together. I said, okay, go on up, and I waited, and about 45 minutes, I brought the rest of the other kids up, and when I got up there, Eric was sitting at the top of Half Dome with his feet dangling over the side, 3,000 foot straight vertical cliff down. I could feel like my throat just close up. I grab him, I pull him back. I look at him, I go, Eric, you don't understand. If you fall off, you see Jesus. I got to see your mother. That is like way, way worse for me, brother. So you are getting away from that edge, right? Because if you've been entrusted with kids to your care, you got to bring them home, right? And if you've been entrusted with traditions and resources and buildings and communities and children, and you got to do everything you can to make sure they are well taken care of and handed over. Management is taking people where they need to go and want to go, and when they get there, they thank you for it. Leadership is taking people where they need to go, they say they want to go, they resist going, and they're mad at you for doing it. And what we're going to talk about today is that dynamic of leadership, where we take people where they need to go. They'll even agree, they'll even ask you to lead them, and then they will resist you all along the way. So, was that exactly good? Okay, good. I'm glad it resonates. So here's the way of thinking about leadership. Leadership is always tied to transformation. That's what's really important. Leadership, to do the act of leadership, means people are going to have to change in order to be successful, in order to accomplish what you've said. And that includes your own transformation. So leadership is energizing a community of people toward their own transformation in order to accomplish a shared mission in the face of a changing world. So let me say a couple things. First of all, I've seen some of you taking pictures of slides. Feel free all you want, but I'm going to send you all these slides. So if you want, right? If you're busy trying, and I know I talk fast, so you'll get all the notes, and I'll give you a way that you can get it. You'll be able to get them on your phone by the end of the day. It'll be easy. I've got some very smart people back at home who are all like 12 years old who have figured out the technology, and so just so you know that. A second part about that I want you to know is that for me, one of the beautiful parts about being in a place like this is it allows me to continue to engage with people who really are in the middle of everyday ministry. That's where I started. Like I now serve in a seminary, but my heart is the local church. And so, when I was 23 years old, I was working for Youth for Christ. I was running a campus life club at the time. And I was invited to come on the staff at Hollywood Presbyterian at 23 to be in charge of their college ministry. And they invited me onto their staff, and they said, look, you're going to run out of those little youth talks you do by Christmas. So we're going to send you to Fuller Seminary, and because we need you to learn how to teach the Bible every single week. And that was great, because I ran out of them by like Thanksgiving. And so it was really important that I learned how to teach the Bible. I went to seminary because I was serving in a church. I didn't go to seminary to serve in a church. I went to seminary because I needed every day that week to have more training so that I could serve these people who had been entrusted to my care. And what's powerful for me was that Hollywood Presbyterian paid for my seminary. And everywhere I go, I tell this story because their investment in me when I was 23 and had little more than arrogance behind me was this amazing investment. And what it meant was that when I finished my master's degree, since I had no debt, my wife and I could actually think about taking on the responsibility for my doing a PhD. So I stayed at Fuller, and I just paid as I went, but I was working full time. So I crammed this 4-year PhD into 9 years. And over that entire time, I was learning while leading. And that's the process that you're going to find is just central to the way I understand leadership formation and what I do today. So basically, here's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about we're going to do 2 sessions this morning when you're sharp. This is where most of the content comes. This afternoon, there's more jokes. And then in the afternoon, we're going to talk about conflict, like the way in which, and so that'll keep you interested. And then in the last session, I'll be talking about the research out of my new book that I've been working on that I need to finish like on the plane on the way home to get sent off. So that's what we'll be doing today, and we'll take you through. One other thing is a couple times throughout the day, I'm going to ask you to talk to the people next to you. It's more important that you talk to each other than you just listen to me. So if you'd like to use the restroom and come back and sit next to somebody else, nobody will notice. Because so whoever you're sitting next to, you could end up in a conversation with, okay? So One of the other reasons that I'm glad to be here is to be with Methodists, because it was a gathering with a group of Methodists that actually changed my life and changed my direction of my life. So one afternoon, I was with a group of Methodists in Portland, Maine, and everything changed for me. And it went like this. I had finished my doctoral dissertation, my PhD at Fuller. It became a book called It Takes a Church to Raise a Christian. It was built on communal practices of spiritual formation based on the doctrine of the Trinity. My whole life, I assumed that I would basically be a pastor who would be all about how do you create communities that transform people's lives. That's what I cared deeply about. I was asked to fly to Portland, Maine, and at the time I wasn't doing a lot of speaking, but it was kind of a big deal to wake up in the morning looking at the Pacific Ocean, fly all day, end up in the dark, and wake up the next morning looking at the Atlantic Ocean, and end up in this sanctuary that if you've ever been to the Northeast, it was this beautiful, old, like endowed sanctuary that had probably been there since the Revolutionary War, and it was filled with people who all wanted to talk about formation of people, formation, and so it was a Christian education conference. So throughout the morning, I did 3 keynotes, one on the kingdom of God, one on spiritual formation, one on Christian community. And then at the afternoon, they asked if I would do like a question answer time before I left. And about 60 people out of the 200 and so that were there came. Now, my wife's a therapist, so and she has taught me that in groups of 60, extroverts shine, introverts hide, and everybody likes it that way. Except that when you're doing a discussion, it means that you get all the extrovert questions and the introverts hoping that the extroverts can read their mind. And so she gave me a couple of techniques that I sometimes use to be able to get all the questions. And so one of the things I did is I just said, before we start, we're going to go around the room and we're going to gather all the questions up, and then we're going to decide as a group what we want to talk about. And the very first person said, you talked a lot about the connection of short-term mission and discipleship. I'd like to talk more about that. I went, great. And the next 59 others all asked basically the same question. What can we do to keep our churches from dying? Now, here's why that was so interesting to me. I hadn't come to talk about church renewal or church growth or anything like that. I'd come to talk about taking the church deeper, not broader. But what they were worrying about, what was keeping them up at night, even though they knew the agenda was about Christian community and spiritual formation, what they were thinking about is, what can we do on Sunday morning that can possibly compete with the Sunday New York Times, soccer, and trips to Starbucks? What can we possibly do? We have got whole sanctuaries that are mostly empty. We've got whole generations that are leaving. We know that this isn't working the way it worked before. What can we do to keep our churches from dying? If you think this is just a Northeast thing, good. I'm glad. Every now and then I just want to check. I'm going to Phoenix, Arizona on Monday, and there's going to be a bunch of folks going, our churches are doing okay, if you're over 90. But let me take you from Portland, Maine to Alabama, to the belt buckle of the Bible Belt. One of my colleagues in the Presbyterian Church and I did this national council for a couple of years, and I led this national initiative. And one of the guys there was he was a regional, I think you'd call it district person in the Presbyterian Church for one of our synods in Alabama. He spent his whole life with churches in Alabama, and and I asked him, I said, I'm from California. We're always talking about change. Like, what's the change been like in the South? And he said, look, it's subtler, but it's significant. He said 40 years ago in Alabama, he literally just retired last year. I saw him at one of these events I did this last spring. He said 40 years ago in Alabama, you didn't even keep track of church attendance or church membership. Everybody in town knew everybody was going to go to one of the churches. He said, because 40 years ago in Alabama, if a man skipped church on Sunday, his boss asked him about it at work on Monday. So if you just think about that, if you think about your family's financial security is tied to your church attendance, guess what it does to church attendance? What he was describing was the way the culture supported Christianity, the way in which the culture gives and for the longest time gave Christianity a home court advantage. So I've traveled in lots of places. It's been amazing the last 5 years. I've gone to just so many small towns that feel basically like the same city planner planned them. There's like a town square. There's a statue of the most famous dead guy. There's a courthouse and a library and the first church of whoever got there first, right? It's like First Lutheran, First Methodist, First Baptist. And all the other first churches, they're all on 2nd Street because everybody knew that the center of society should be law, education, and religion. And that religion was Christian religion, even when people weren't necessarily Christians. If you ever come and visit me in Pasadena in Fed Fuller, I've got in my office a copy of the Los Angeles Times from December 1963. I have it because someone saved it because the front page was on the Kennedy assassination and the Warren Commission. They gave it to me because the back page of the front section of the LA Times had an article on Hollywood Presbyterian Church that in December 1963 was the largest Presbyterian church in the country with over 9,000 members. And it made the LA Times. I served there, that's where I trained, when it had about 4,000 members. Today it has under 1,000 members. It just went through a pastor shift, and it's probably now in the hundreds on a Sunday morning. But the reason I kept it is that in the Los Angeles Times in December 1963, there was a box printed where the LA Times gave you a week's worth of daily Bible readings. If you can remember when the LA Times, the Washington Post, and the New York Times would help you with your morning quiet time, you can remember when the culture, when Christianity had a home court advantage, a home field advantage. It's what we call Christendom. It's the world in which not everybody's a Christian. In December 1963, Billy Graham's crusades were at an all-time high. People needed Jesus then like they do today. But what is the culture. It would be like having your own, if you get your home court for a basketball game, there's a huge advantage than being on the road. And Christianity was always playing in a home court. And now it's like we're never playing on the home court. And that shift is significant in lots of ways. I would travel around the country, and I would coach and consult, and I was doing this initiatives for our denomination. And I would get to talk to pastors, and pastors would say to me, they would kind of whisper to me about the way in which they were struggling, and they didn't understand why. In 2010, Fuller Seminary did a survey of our alums. So, by the way, here's some inside baseball for you. Most of you probably went to seminaries or graduate schools or college. If you ever get a survey from your institution, know this. It comes from the advancement office. The people who survey are the people who are going to ask you for money. Why? Because every institution has a metric that as our alumni get older and have more disposable income, we should get more from them. And there's like a chart they can figure it out. Fuller has 40,000 alums in 400 countries around the world. And so since we've been one of the largest seminaries, there was this metric that thought as our students get older and are in a place where they can give more, then we should be getting more from them. And so what they were really trying to find out was, why aren't you all giving us as much as we planned on you giving us? Now, you really just can't ask people that. It tends to make them a little annoyed. So what you do is you hire a really high-priced consulting firm to ask it for you. And the reason why the high-priced consulting firm makes so much money is they know to ask a different question. And the question is this: how do you feel about Fuller Seminary? And the answer they got back was, We love Fuller Seminary. We love being alums from Fuller. We're proud of being alums from Fuller. We buy all the books from the Fuller professors. I got a special spot in my office with all my textbooks from seminary. Every time the newsletter tells us of a new thing, we're so excited. We want to come back to Pasadena and get a new t-shirt. We love it. But seminary didn't prepare me for this. That's what pastors were telling me around the country. That's what I was hearing from so many different people. It's what Fuller discovered. It is what literally I have heard in every setting that I've been. I've been in Scotland. I've been in New Zealand. I've been across the country. If you talk to people who are in leadership today, they will tell you, I love my experience of what I learned in theological education, and most of it is irrelevant to my day-to-day life of trying to lead this people in this context, in this space. What could Fuller give to me today? Darrell Guter out of Princeton Seminary put it this way: if Western societies have become post-Christian mission fields, then how can traditional churches become then missionary churches? And that's the struggle, right? The mission field isn't sending money over seawater. It's it's crossing the sidewalk into your community. The mission field, the world around us that is so profoundly different, that needs the gospel, is near us. And the struggle that we have is trying to figure out how to lead in that context when it's right here, when we were trained for a different way of leading. So this is what I want you to do. This is the first time I'm going to ask you to spend some time with each other. If you don't know the person next to you, introduce yourself. If you do, then you don't have to. You can, or if you thought you met them, if you forgot their name, this gives you an excuse to meet their name, right? But here's actually all I want you to do is just in twos or threes. I know you're Midwesterners. I'm going to have to interrupt you in a few minutes. I'm not giving you a lot of time, right? But if you could just share, how have you experienced the world changing? And because the world has changed, the impact on the church. How have you experienced it? Just like my friend in Alabama, just like I'm talking about this with you today. If you say, here's how I've experienced the world changing, and here's how this has impacted our ministry, the way I think about church, just share those stories. I'm going to give you 5 minutes, not a lot of time, but I want you thinking about it, and I want it to be as concrete as possible as we go into this next section. So go ahead and go. I'll interrupt you in just a few minutes. So I'll give you 1 more minute, okay? About 1 more minute. So let me interrupt. I'll give you some chance to talk later. I'm just going to keep doing this all day. I'm just going to get used to talking, and then I'm going to be interrupting you just all day long. But here's the reason why. Adults learn better when we go from the concrete to the abstract, rather than the abstract to the concrete. The more we can ground everything we're talking about in your life experience and in your context, we're going to do more of that throughout the day, the more you can think specifically about the stuff that you're working on, the more it's going to be not only relevant to you, but actionable. You'll be able to leave here with some concrete things to do. So I want you thinking about and experiencing the notion of that change and how you experience it in a concrete way. I also know that as soon as you start talking to anybody else, they've experienced change, but it shows up different in their life, right? So just age particularly is a different place, location, where you are in the country, where you grew up, what the expectations were, different settings. We're going to be talking about that throughout the day. So notice that we're all experiencing change, but we all experience change differently, which is one of the reasons why you can't have so many cookie cutter solutions. So let me give you context for thinking about all this, and it comes from one of my favorite stories. And it's an interesting story because it's actually fraught. It's not an easy story. It's a story that has its own kind of problematic pieces built right into the middle of it. In this way, it's not only a story from history, but it's a lot like a biblical story too. One famous Old Testament professor, E.P. Sanders, once said, the Bible doesn't give us models to emulate. It gives us mirrors to identify with. It gives us one model to emulate, really, if we're just one, right? It gives us Jesus. But everybody else is just their own clown car of things, right? It's just its own mix. And one of the parts that we have to work on all the time is figuring that out, and especially when you think about leadership. And this is true with this story as well. So I want to take you to August 12th, 1805. To the border of Montana and Idaho. There's a little spring right on the border of Montana and Idaho. And on August 12th, 1805, Meriwether Lewis drank out of that spring. He'd left in 1803, he'd left St. Charles, Missouri, to take the Corps of Discovery up the Missouri River. They spent the winter with the Mandan tribe, and then they found themselves that following August, him and a scouting party drinking out of this spring. That was significant because what the Corps of Discovery was about in 1803 was about the way Meriwether Lewis and his partner William Clark had been sent by Thomas Jefferson to find a water route that would connect the United States of America, which at that point only went as far as the Mississippi River, to the Pacific Ocean. That water route was critical for that young nation's economic survival. It was the strategy of economics that went back 300 years all the way to Europe. You see, what folks in Europe figured out was there's raw materials and stuff all over the world, but it's hard to get them to Europe over the big continents that are Asia and Europe. That if you can take stuff over water, it is much easier than taking stuff over land. So controlling the water routes became the dominant international economic strategy of Europe. And it really meant we're going to control the water routes, and we're going to control it at the cost of anything that gets in our way. So when a group of Europeans discover an entire continent that is filled with peoples and tribes and cultures and folks, all they thought about was, this thing is in the way. For 100 years, all they tried to do is get through the darn thing. It took them 100 years to figure out that what they'd stumbled onto was actually way more important than what they were looking for. But by 1803, that same mental model was at work, which was, if this fledgling United States that at any given moment feels like it could be attacked again by the Great Britain, which it was within just a few years, if for us to be wealthy enough to be able to withstand and to continue to survive, we need to control the water routes. And the way of controlling the water route was if you could figure out how to make the connection between the Pacific Ocean, and boats had already gone up what is now the Columbia River. If you could connect that to the Mississippi River that connects to the Gulf of Mexico that would then go on, if you could connect that to the Missouri River, if you could own that and claim that, well, that would be the key. It would be like owning the internet today. It would be like being Amazon today, right? So the entire intention was owning that water route. It was a complete economic play. And the Corps of Discovery was trying to discover that water route that everybody knew was there. For 300 years, they had drawn maps that literally showed the Mississippi River, the Missouri River, the Columbia River, and this place in the middle that we just need to figure out where it connects. So after 18 months of going upstream, spending a winter with the Mandan tribe in North Dakota, taking off again and going up as far up the Missouri River as they could. After 18 months of paddling upstream, Meriwether Lewis takes a drink. One of the guys on his party puts their foot on each side of this tiny little spring and exulted that they'd conquered the mighty Missouri River. And now they believed they would send back word to the party. They would bring up the canoes up the stream. They would pull them out. They would take them over this little ledge. They would put them in a spring in the other side. They would begin to push them into the river. And after 18 months of paddling hard upstream, they would now get to go downstream. They would float and ride all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They would take a selfie and send it back to Thomas Jefferson. They would turn around. They would come back, and they would bring back the word that they discovered the Northwest Passage, and they would go down in history as the greatest explorers since Magellan. And Meriwether Lewis walks up the side of the Lemhi Pass, looks over to find the stream on the other side, and discovers, as you know, the Rocky Mountains. 300 miles of mountains. Now, two really interesting little pieces. Number one, the Mandan tribe told them, you know, there are mountains. Like, there's a river on the other side, but you're going to have to go over some mountains. And they went, mountains schmountains. We're from Virginia. We're great at mountains. You ever seen Shenandoah National Park? You ever been in the Appalachian Mountains? I mean, they're lovely, don't get me wrong, but this morning I couldn't find out where Mount Pleasant was. I'm thinking, there's got to be a mountain around here somewhere, right? When people say mountains, they have different mental models, and their mental models were the Appalachian Mountains, these beautiful, lovely, rounded hills that you can almost imagine some burly dudes dragging a canoe over. They had no mental model for mountains that jutted up to 14,000 feet, that would go above the tree line, that were alpine granite peaks that would stretch on for 300 miles and would be covered in hip-deep snow for 60. They're canoers, they're water guys. They're planning on river rafting, and they've run into mountains. How do you canoe over mountains? And this is exactly the place where I believe that the church is today. And one of my other interesting stories about this is that Meriwether Lewis wrote in his journal, they'd seen those mountains for 3 months. You been to Colorado? It's hard to hide the Rocky Mountains. They've just been looming up there in front of them. And yet he wrote in his journal, I refuse to believe this will be anything but a safe and comfortable path. We have this tremendous amount of denial. Because what we believe in our heart of hearts is that the world in front of us will be exactly the same as the world behind us. They had this view of the geography of the United States, that it would be a long, slow, gradual uphill to a long, slow, gradual downhill. They had no idea that it actually went up, jutted up, and fell off. And they were not prepared for a geography in front of them that was completely different than that which was behind them. And because they had been experts in that world behind them, because they had the ability to navigate that world behind them, they assumed they would be experts in this world in front of them. And so they assumed that since this had been a safe and comfortable path, this will be too. And what their expectation is because we have done so well and traveled so far and paddled so hard, it's probably going to get easier any day now. And they were rudely, rudely awakened. Now, here's one of the things I often think about. Why didn't Meriwether Lewis just turn around and go back? Ain't no water route. Someone should tell the president. Let's go back and tell them, send people with horses. I mean, it would make sense in one level, but he didn't. And we'll talk about why he didn't. For many of us in the church today, we find ourselves in this moment. We feel like we're looking over the Lemhi Pass. We're seeing how the world is dramatically different than when we were children, or how we were raised, or how we were trained. And we've got to ask ourselves, what are we going to do? Meriwether Lewis wrote in his journal, we proceeded on. That's all he wrote. One of the men wrote, those are the most terrible mountains we ever beheld. Because he was an enlisted man, and he probably figured his job was to drag the canoes over them, right? Many of us find ourselves in this moment, and we, if not ourselves, our congregations are in this moment where we're looking at the future, and what we're saying is what really matters isn't going forward. What really matters is canoeing. What we have to tell people is about our great experience canoeing. So we start creating entire industries that are built around telling and passing on the tradition of canoeing. We go back and we do familiar runs again. We invite people to get into the canoe and experience. We tell stories about the heyday of canoeing. We fight to make sure that canoeing, no matter what we do, is going to be important. And we find ourselves back in that setting, defending canoeing. Others of us just get here and get stuck. One of my friends has been a pastor in Denver, Colorado. He said Denver, Colorado is made up of the incredible people. It was founded by the incredible people who made themselves across through all the dangers of the Great Plains, looked up one day and said, far enough, stopping right here. This is it. Beautiful view, lovely, we know this soil right here. And some of us are literally thinking to ourselves, if I could just keep my church right here, if we could just hang on, if we don't have to go forward, we don't want to go back, if we could just make this work, at least until I can retire and get a pension, if we could just make this work, this would be all we'd want. But others of us know that there's something about stepping over that path and going into that uncharted territory that's going to cause us to think differently because of what we're called to do for the gospel. We were trained for a different context. We were trained for rivers, not mountains. So which means when we step over into uncharted territory, we need to learn a new way of leading. So this morning, as we talk about this, we'll talk about some rules for uncharted territory. And in the book, I pull out some of these rules that you can take in deeply. One of them is that the world in front of you is nothing like the world behind you. That being an expert in the world behind you doesn't necessarily guarantee anything about the world in front of you. If you were brought on the trip because you could build a boat by hand, and they did, they invented their own boats. And because you can navigate waters better than anybody else, and they did. Actually, one of the great stories of Lewis and Clark is after they made it through the Lemhi Pass, and after they made it across the mountains, and when they finally found the Columbia River, they had to build new boats, and they dug out new canoes, and they created new boats, and they rode the rapids. And the native peoples came out to watch. They were like, oh, watch, this is going to be great. They're going to be dead in no time. Nobody runs this river. Go ahead, have fun. I mean, they're probably selling tickets, bringing out the kids. This will be awesome. And they made it. They were incredible at rivers. And some of us are exactly in that place. If 1963 ever comes back, I want to say to all of you Methodists, we Presbyterians are going to rule. We're going to own 1963. We're awesome in 1963. 1963 was our heyday, and it was great for people who looked like me. And in the world we're in, if we are trying hard to get back 1963, then we're not living into the world that's in front of us. No one's going to follow you off the map unless they trust you on the map. And so a lot of the things that we've done to get us this far are really important. And a lot of the ways we spend our days and a lot of the skill sets we bring are critically important to our work. And they will remain so. But in uncharted territory, adaptation is everything. And that's the one thing we haven't been trained for, and we will talk about more. And this afternoon, we're going to talk about how you can't go alone, but you haven't succeeded until you survive the sabotage, and how sabotage happens every single time. How we see it in Exodus, we see it in Paul's ministry, we see it in our ministries, that sabotage is natural and normal and to be expected. And everybody will be changed, especially the leader. What it requires of us isn't trying harder. It requires of us to be trained for a different context. One of my friends, Steve Yamaguchi, was the dean of Fuller students at Fuller Theological Seminary, and before that, he was my executive presbyter in Los Ranchos Presbytery. He had basically Clark's old job, but up in our area. And one of the things he told me was a story about his spiritual director, who was a Catholic priest. And the Catholic priest's brother was a Marine Corps jet fighter pilot. So imagine Thanksgiving at their house, like I always think, right? For his birthday, the jet fighter pilot took the priest onto the Marine base, and he got permission for the priest to get to spend some time in a flight simulator, pretending that he was flying around in all the military's fanciest fighter jets. And after doing that for a while and doing what you'd probably do in a flight simulator, he comes out of it kind of exhausted and exhilarated. And the priest, because he's a spiritual director and he's great at asking questions, turns to the guy training and says, "Why are you guys so committed to training with flight simulators?" And the guy who's in charge of training puts it this way: "At the moment of crisis, you will not rise to the occasion. You will default to your training." The more critical it becomes, the more you default to what you were trained to do. So for those of us who've been in ministry for all these years, think about what we've been trained to do. I think about this all the time. I'm at a seminary. I would say that every one of our students is there because someone said to them, "You're like the best Christian I know. You should go pro," right? "We should send you off to professional Christian school. That'll be awesome," right? And when they tell them why they should go, it's because they were really good in usually one of three areas. They were good in preaching or programming or pastoral care, right? They were good at preaching and teaching the scriptures, and so someone said you should go to seminary, or they were really good at running programs, and so someone said, "Hey man, someday you might not want to do junior high lock-ins, so you should get trained in how to preach and preach and teach so you can be a senior pastor and sleep. That would be awesome." And you got to know that when people go to crisis, they come to the church, and even someday when you're tired of preaching every week and you're not going to do a junior high lock-in, there's always going to be people in need, so we always need people to do pastoral care. But what happens when we live in a world where you can preach and teach all you want, but people won't listen to us? Right? I'm a good talker. It's like my one skill. One of my friends said, "We Presbyterians are so good at talking about stuff, after a while we think we've actually done it," right? Right? We're just convinced that if we had a sermon series on revival, that had happened. Well, last year was revival. This year is going to be about renewal, right? Right? So we preach and we teach and we think that makes a difference. Or we decide to go run a program, and maybe we decide we're going to go out and we're going to ask our neighbors what they need from us, and we're going to try to listen, and we're going to run a program, and you put a lot of resources and you build a whole program. Maybe you build a building for it, right? How many churches built gymnasiums because youth needed something good to do? And then you run something, and what happens every time? They don't show up. Next thing you know, you're trying to fill the gymnasium. And when you ask why, and they tell you because it used to be 30 years ago, kids needed something good today, kids are over-programmed. I tell youth ministry, the most valuable thing you could probably do is plan a really big event and then cancel it. Say, stay home with your family. Notice how much our context changes things. Even pastoral care, I can't tell you how many times in the church we would shame people who went into the hospital. "I know you just had a heart bypass, but you were out in a day. We didn't have time to care for you." If you won't tell us when you're in the hospital, how are we going to ever be able to do pastoral care? They're like, "Look, I'm at home." Well, yeah, I'm supposed to come to your house? This is California. We don't show up at people's houses. When those things don't work, what do you do? If these are the things we've been trained in, what do you do? Ed Friedman was a Jewish rabbi of a large congregation in Washington, D.C. He was also a marriage and family therapist, so he was trained in family systems theory, and he was a consultant in Washington, D.C. So he said he used to see dysfunction at every level. Listen to how he talks about it. Let me show you this quote. It's a longer quote, but it's worth working through. He puts it this way: when any relationship system, okay, stop there for a second. Make a mental note. A church is a relationship system. That's really what we are. Any relationship system is imaginatively gridlocked. When was the last time you were in a meeting where you could feel that everybody was imaginatively gridlocked? Yeah, last night, right? Yeah, I was thinking, were you in our faculty meeting? Right? Right? You just feel like no one can even think about another option. We can't even think outside the box. We can't even imagine something else. We're just stuck. It cannot get free simply through more thinking about the problem. Conceptually stuck systems cannot be unstuck simply by trying harder. My friends, trying harder to paddle in a river where there ain't no water is not only going to exhaust you, but it's not going to get you anywhere. Some of us feel like this is our lives. We wake up every day trying as hard as we can. We work and we labor and we give ourselves to this work, and nothing changes. Because conceptually stuck systems can't be unstuck simply by trying harder. If you take nothing out of it today, take this, and then take a couple of days off, right? Just to know that anything you need to store up energy for the new next day, because this isn't going to work to keep paddling harder. For a fundamental reorientation to occur, that spirit of adventure, which optimizes serendipity, which allows you to see things you didn't see, learn things you didn't learn, recognize things that you never even imagined before, and which enables new perceptions beyond the control of our thinking processes. Our imaginative gridlock must happen first. What do you need? The first thing you need is a spirit of adventure. A spirit of adventure. What did that mean to Lewis and Clark? And what does that mean to Ed Friedman? It's really similar to what it also means to folks who study leadership in uncharted territory, in innovation and change. And what a spirit of adventure means is that it requires learning and it results in loss. That it requires us to begin with the notion that we are in uncharted territory, that we are not experts, that our training did not prepare us for this, that where we are is actually where we are, and that we're going to have to learn. And the worst part about it is that it is going to be experienced as loss. If you're the dude who built the canoe, and you were brought on the journey because you're the expert with canoes, all you're doing is looking for water, and there isn't any. And literally you're told, drop the canoe and come with us, and we'll find something for you to do. And that experience is happening over and over and over again. I work in a seminary setting where we have had to try to answer that question from our alums who told us the world isn't working for me. The world I'm in that seminary didn't prepare me for. I was brought to Fuller to be the guy who helps us rethink that and work on that. And when I jumped into a faculty that already began to shape its curriculum, and my job was to take that shaped curriculum and turn that into a culture that would be different for the folks today, that would prepare people for the world we're in, the amount of resistance from our most senior faculty was palpable. Right? Because the loss is significant. One of our faculty members literally was the most renowned philosopher in her field. She was featured in the Los Angeles Times with an article called Jesus with a Genius Grant. And when I came in to see her, because she had been one of my professors when I was a student, and I told her about my new job, and she said, well, these changes around here mean one thing for me. I've spent my entire career having academic credibility. I've spent my entire career publishing over and over again, giving to this institution everything it is, and today I am an elective. I'm not even considered important enough to make a student take one of my classes. Some of us feel that way a lot. It requires learning, it results in loss. Psychologists tell us that the three hardest words for someone to say are not I love you or I forgive you, no matter what happens in your marriage. The three hardest words for someone to say are I don't know. The University of Leeds did a study on 7-year-olds. 7-year-olds, right? Think about a 7-year-old you know. Like just the world is just like 7-year-olds. It's my favorite age. You watch these kids. They asked a group of 7-year-olds a nonsense question. What does blue smell like? The majority of 7-year-olds made up an answer. They're smart kids. They didn't say, blue's a color, it don't smell. or I don't understand, or I don't know, or whatever it is. No, they made up an answer. When you ask them why they made up an answer, it's because they said they felt embarrassed not to know. At 7. Imagine what it's like for us at 47, 57, 67. We are not wired to be learners. We are wired to want to be experts. And Eric Hoffer said, in times of great change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists. To become people who are learners is the first thing we do when we step into an unknown world. For Lewis and Clark, this literally meant that when they stepped over the Lemhi Pass into the American West, they were not only off the map, and not only were all the maps wrong, they were lost. Dayton Duncan, who is an author and scholar who wrote about them, put it this way. He said, look, Meriwether Lewis knew less about the American West than Neil Armstrong knew about the moon. Neil Armstrong had at least seen pictures of the moon. So when they stepped over the Lemhi Pass, they were lost, all of them. All of them. All but one. She was a Native American teenage nursing mother. In school, you probably heard her name as Sacagawea. In the journals, they wrote down her name as Sacagawea or Sakakawea. So if nothing else, I'd like to give her back her name because they probably heard it from her. Up until that point, they'd never written down a single word she'd said. They didn't pay attention to a single feeling she said. They didn't even pay attention to the fact that she was carrying a nursing baby. But she was so important to them that even though that she had just given birth, they decided to hire the French trapper Charbonneau, who was her husband, and a husband of a couple of wives, and he had a couple of wives, and he abandoned the other one, and he was not very respected at all, but because she had been kidnapped as a child, as a Shoshone child at 11 or 12 years old, had been taken over the Lemhi Pass and had been kept as a slave by the Mandan tribe. Charbonneau either won her in a card game or bought her. She became one of his wives, and Lewis and Clark decided to take him so that they could have her go as a translator and be with them. And they took her back over the Lemhi Pass, and they were now in home territory. Just by the way, anytime you think about the Corps of Discovery, and it's an amazing, stunning story, and you think about these great men who rode rapids and climbed mountains and faced down grizzly bears and went through swarms of mosquitoes. Remember, she did it too, with a baby. When they stepped over the Lemhi Pass, she was the one that was at home. And they had to learn to listen to her. She's the one that took them to the Shoshone tribe. She's the one that negotiated the trade. She's the one in this amazing story where she's in the middle of her translating for the tribal chief, Kameawait. It becomes clear that the Kameawait is her brother, that she is the young girl who had been kidnapped years before and they'd lost, that these white people had brought her home. They wept and rejoiced, and they asked her to stay, and she decided that instead she would go with them. And the Shoshone, so grateful and generous, not only traded horses, but gave them another man they called Old Toby, who knew the mountains like the back of his hand to guide them through the wilderness and through the mountains, and they made it because of it. My friends, this to me is this wonderful metaphor of the way that God provides for us when we don't even know. That in our midst are people who were not trained in the power or privilege of Christendom. They didn't get shaped at a place like Hollywood Presbyterian. They weren't formed and trained in the way that we were. And they're all around us. It's the global church that is exploding. The fastest growing church in the world today is a church in Iran led by women who are literally treated as nothing in their culture, and Christianity gives them dignity. in places across the country and across the world. It's the Latinx church, the African American church. And this is always the point that makes the most people the most uncomfortable. But sociologists of religion will tell us that of all the factors that make the United States more religious today than Europe, the number one factor, the reason why we have more vibrant faith than Europe today, of all the factors, and there's many, the number one is immigration. The people coming to our country are mostly Christians. And they come bringing a faith that has been tested by being refugees or having to flee or having to travel long distances. And they bring a vibrancy to the church that we don't see in other places. When I went back to Fuller Seminary as a vice president, they said, "You're a new vice president. We'd like you to meet all the people in all the departments that report to you." And I went, "How great." And they took me on a little tour of like cookies and coffee one afternoon of all the different departments. It was wonderful. I meet them, I say a few words, they say some stuff, we talk about how we're going to work together, and they meet me. It's great. We go into one office, and they said, "We'd like you to meet one person. You're not going to get to work with him very much because he's a student worker and he's graduating in 3 weeks, but we are so proud of him, and we know he's going to do great things, and you should meet him, Todd. We'd like to introduce you to Pablo Kim." Pablo Kim. His parents were Korean missionaries to Argentina. He grew up speaking Korean in his home, speaking Spanish to go to school, and he learned English so that he could do graduate work in the United States. He's trilingual. The future leaders are not people who look like me out of Hollywood Presbyterian. It's Pablo Kim coming out of a family that's been deeply connected to the mission field. And these folks are all around us. They are the folks who have not been connected to us because they were not trained in Christendom, and yet they are the voices around us. Dave Gibbons, an Asian American pastor who started a church, a multicultural church in Irvine, which was a mostly white Orange County community, a church that had absolutely no building. And before there was Twitter or social media, people would have to call in to find out where it would meet. And it was filled with people who wanted a different view, a different kind of church. And Dave Gibbons put it this way: the future is already here, it's just on the margins. And if we can become the kind of leaders who invite the margins in, like Lewis and Clark, who were literally Meriwether Lewis, tutored by Thomas Jefferson, trained in the White House, given the best education that anybody could get, military leaders who found that in Sacagawea, the future was already in front of them. Let me tell you one story, and then we'll take a break, just to give you a vision of what I believe this is all about for us. They eventually made it through the mountains, got into the Columbia River, took it all the way to what is now Oregon. They were there on the Pacific coast, and they had to decide where they were going to spend the winter. They weren't going to be able to go back. They had just made it through 60 miles of hip-deep snow, 300 miles of mountains. They were haggard, and they were hungry, and they were tired, and they knew they didn't have the strength to go back. They'd have to spend the winter in Oregon, and if you've ever spent a winter in Oregon, it's just wet the whole time. You just feel like you're just getting moss on you the whole time. It's just going to be miserable. And what they decided to do is, because they're going to do there, they're going to establish a fort. And if you establish a fort in unoccupied territory, and you plant the flag, what you basically have done is you are establishing the United States of America. And because they were a military unit who had the complete authority of the President of the United States, wherever they planted that flag would be the United States of America in the New World. And Lewis and Clark, because they were the military commanders, would get to establish America. And they decided instead what they would do is they would establish America with a completely, radically American idea. They had a vote. They said, we could put America on this side of the river, or we could put America on this side of the river. And what we're going to decide is we're all going to decide where America is, and everybody gets a vote. And everybody got one vote. Everyone, including Sacagawea, and including York, William Clark's African-American slave. The first time a woman a Native American or an African American had a vote in anything like an American election was in 1805. So far off the map, it was the future. It would take the rest of the world 100 years to catch up. But they were in the future. What I believe is that God is taking the church into the future because the world is frightened of the future. We have a world that all around us, people are beginning to hunker down and pull back and get not only nostalgic, but literally violent, that they're beginning to pull away because we're of the uncertainties of the future. And that uncertainty is beginning to take its toll on culture and country and neighbors. And we are the people who know the future. We are the people who know that a day will come when every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. That a day is going to come where the kingdoms of this world are going to become the kingdoms of our God and of his Christ, and he shall reign. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Don't you wish we had a choir? Right? We are the ones. And I believe that God is sending his church into the future, into uncharted territory, so that we can show the rest of the world what the future is supposed to be like. And if we keep trying to hold on to our canoes and circle back to the past and long for 1963, we lose the chance to lead into God's good future. So after we take a break, we'll come back and we'll talk about how we navigate that and what do we learn as we do it together. Why don't we come back in 15 minutes, say at 10:30, and gather together.